let's get it started. So this panel is beyond Anglophone podcasting. My name is Josephine Karianjahi, and I am co-founder and co-director at Africa Podfest. The International Women's Podcast Festival, brought to you by Pinterest, is bringing together women from all over the world to celebrate what is happening in podcasting and find out more about the incredible opportunities that exist in the world of audio. This festival isn't just for presenters or producers, it's for anyone who loves podcasts and wants to connect to the best in audio. The Global Voices stage at the Women's Podcast Festival is providing a platform for podcast enthusiasts from across Africa, North and South America, Asia, and the Middle East to continue the conversation about audio and specifically hear from women who are working across the world in this space. I'd like to have you here, and you are so welcome to this panel. I am so excited because everyone who you will hear from at this point in the program has been doing so much across the world. I will not introduce them. They will introduce themselves, and we will start with Kim Fox.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate that. I'm Kim Fox. I am a professor of practice at the American University in Cairo. I also organized and founded Podfest Cairo, Egypt and Africa's first podcasting conference. I am the executive producer of the Ehky Ya Masr podcast, the Tell Your Story Egypt podcast, and we tell narrative nonfiction stories about life in Egypt. And last but not least, I am also the co-president of Air Media, the Associates for Independence in Radio. I have a few other titles, but I'm going to keep it to that to just keep it simple. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conference as well. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Kim. I found out that a lot of your students have actually won international awards and recognitions for their audio projects. So you are definitely putting out people who are changing the audio scene. Welcome. Next, we'll go to Rutendo Nyamuda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Josephine. I'm Rutendo Nyamuda. I'm the founder of Tinzwe Media, a Pan-African podcast company. And under the banner of Tinzwe Media, we've managed to create a few podcasts. The ones that are original to us are the In My 20s podcast, which was my first podcast, which I launched in 2018 when I still was in my 20s. And then we've done work in the podcast for the podcast sessions, which is a Pan-African podcast, as well as the only Pan-African podcast magazine on the continent. And this year, we finally launched our podcast news website dedicated to Pan-African podcast news stories. And then one of my favorite podcasts that we have produced, and the last one is called Inside Once Out, which is a mother tongue poetry podcast. And that is me in the podcast world. Thanks so much. And super excited to be on the panel and super excited for today's discussion. I think it's super engaging and all the women are absolutely amazing. So thank you.
Thank you, Rutendo. I'm so excited also to tell everyone that you are one of the 200 young South Africans to watch. And this is a recognition by the Million Guardians South Africa. So thanks for joining us. We'll go over to Bella Ibrahim.
Hi. Yes, like everyone else, super excited to be on this panel. Thank you, Josephine. I am the marketing director at Kerning Cultures Network. We're one of the big networks in the Middle East and North Africa with shows in both English and Arabic. I think I would say we're best known maybe for our show Bahob, a show all about love stories in all its forms, and many others that I won't get into. But yes, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Bella. I love that you said last year that mainstream media doesn't do a good job of representing the region's youth, and that's why you're filling the gap through your storytelling. So welcome to this conversation. We'll go over to Laura Ubaté. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, super glad of joining this wonderful panel to have the chance of us making this little window in space and time just to get to know everyone else's reality in podcast. I'm a podcast producer at Adonde Media. We're a multilingual podcast production company. We do shows in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and many others. I'm one of the producers of this company that really has opened paths for different kinds of productions in Spanish. And I also am the founder of a local community of podcasters in Colombia, which is called Café Podcastero. I also, like, founding this community in Colombia, I also am a part of Podcasteros, which is a Latin American network of podcast producers in Spanish. We have different projects and we work all across Latin America. Super glad to be here.
Welcome everyone. So if you're thinking about podcasting to the rest of the world, one of the major considerations is that lots of the new podcasts that are coming out are not in English, and yet most of the podcasting world operates in English. So for everyone who's here, what approaches are you taking as a podcaster or a podcast producer in your region? And we'll start with Rutendo.
Thank you so much. Lovely question. And it's such an important question, actually. So I think what we are seeing more and more of what you've spoken about is podcasts being produced in their own languages. Personally, for us, our first kind of dabbling into this was when we produced Inside Once Out, which is our mother tongue poetry podcast. And we were really trying to answer that question, what is the engagement with people when it comes to their mother tongues? And why aren't we producing more ourselves? We want to hype this up, but what are we personally doing? And that's what we were trying to kind of answer or kind of do more of. So what we did is we put an open call out there and we just said, poets who want to express themselves, especially in this global pandemic, write a poem about it. So season 1 of the podcast was called African Poetry in the Time of a Global Pandemic. We ended up producing 9 episodes from 6 different African countries. So the poets are in Yoruba, in Xhosa, in Kikuyu, I forgot all of the languages that they're in, but it was such a beautiful mixing pot. And what we did ask them was we said, we want you to write, speak in your mother tongue, and then we'll translate into English and not the other way around. And if it sounds broken in English, that's what it should sound like, because I think most of the time we think in English. We do a lot of the work that we're doing business-wise in English, but we also need to remember that this is an opportunity for us to preserve our languages and to preserve our cultures and our stories. And podcasting is such a beautiful way and means to do that. We do want to obviously produce a lot more, but I think one of the turns for us in the podcast sessions was when we launched the digital magazine in 2020. And even now with the website, is we're starting to think, I know there's some phenomenal languages that will probably be mentioned in the discussion, but for us, one of the second biggest spoken languages on the continent is French. So it's for us to say to ourselves, we've got this magazine, we've got this website, we've got an incredible amount of French speakers who are reading and speaking and engaging in French, not in English or, in French. What can we do as a platform where we start either translating some of our content, or even, which would be a beautiful dream of mine, to actually have our magazine produced in both English and in French. So those are just some of the things that we've been thinking about doing in the future, what we're doing now and what we're looking at doing in the future as well.
Thank you, Rutendo. We'll go back to Laura.
Yes, I love to hear this kind of things, because on my corner of the world, the work has been from years now. We have been building the podcast industry in Spanish with different accents in Spanish. So I think before that, we used to see just like Colombian movies or Argentinian movies or Mexican movies. These are the 3 top markets of Latin America. And thanks to the Latino Podcast Listener Report and also Encuesta Pod, which is a Latin American survey we do in Podcasteros, we have found the data that allow us to prove that listeners in Latin America can love and hear and follow a podcast that is not in their own Spanish accent. So that has broadened the spectrum, not only for us, but for every producer in Latin America. Today, we are listening to shows that may have a host, a Puerto Rican host with a Mexican host, or a Spanish host with someone from the US, and different kind of stuff. And we have proven that 73% of the people that are listening to podcasts love and they are okay with listening to their show in a different accent in Spanish. So once we are like breaking those barriers, also, I think we are walking towards seeing each other more than the accent that we are born in. So I think that's the most interesting part of not doing a podcast only thinking about the Anglophone market, because at the end of the day, globalization is also a way of like holding our hands, no matter our accent or no matter our culture. So I think we are getting in a very bright and broad state where we can collaborate between accents, collaborate all, hopefully between languages too.
Thank you. And, Kim, you've worked extensively in radio and now switched over into podcasting. And now you're podcasting from Egypt to the Arab-speaking world, similar to the work that Kerning Cultures is doing. Could you talk a little bit about what your approach is?
Our approach is to try to determine which stories are best suited to put into, say, with English or Arabic. And that's because we have a very small team. We have low to no budget. And so, my experience, at least, trying to produce the high quality level of audio that we're used to putting out, it takes a little bit of money to put behind it. And so we're looking for some funding sources, but we do usually dedicate one piece to being in Arabic in our series when we push them out, which is not enough. On the back end, what we're trying to do is provide the education and knowledge base to, at least we're doing training. And so we do have access to provide training in Arabic. Getting a lot of our team is fluent in Arabic. I think I'm the only one who's not, actually. So we're just working on improving that. It just takes some time. Being a full-time professor and wearing so many different hats has been a little challenge for myself, but we're definitely creating collaborations to help bridge some of those gaps.
Thanks, and over to you, Bella.
Yeah, so Kerning Cultures Network, it was originally, we started with one English show. And so I think coming to the realization that there was this massive need and this massive gap in the Arabic podcasting market was something that we discovered in 2018 while we were in an incubator with Media Matter, or Matter Media, sorry. And so I think that was when we realized that there was this massive opportunity to really reach our own audience much more directly than just producing in English. The first couple shows we produced in Arabic, our goal was to just get a feel for what the appetite was in the Arabic speaking listener base. So we were releasing shows to a pan-Arab audience, if you will. So shows were really covering stories from multiple countries. Like one show could have, stories from Lebanon and Saudi and Egypt and Dubai. And what we saw was people were very eager to hear stories from other parts of the region that they don't necessarily always interact with, rather than just listening to stories from their own home country or hometown. And so I think that was something that we really started to lean into. We saw that listeners were really engaged. They were eager to hear stories from around the region. Through that, we also came across some challenges, I think, in terms of like navigating dialect was always one we had to navigate, because we want the guests to feel comfortable speaking in their natural dialect, but how do we navigate a host dialect? How do we present like the most natural speaking possible, but also make it accessible to as many people as possible when a show is really spanning across more than one country? So that's something we've encountered. And I think something else as a team we had a lot of conversations about there's a lot of topics that we felt comfortable covering in English that maybe would be considered more taboo, that we would really have conversations to talk about, well, if we wanted to talk about this in Arabic alone, that felt like a really large signal or a really large risk that we wanted to take as a team. But to find the language, to make the editorial decisions about how to talk about some things, what vocabulary to use, what dialect to use, we would get feedback from listeners saying that they sometimes were used to hearing about certain topics, like on Just a Day we explore topics about our bodies. And so we get into, like puberty, sexuality, gender, like body image, like really a wide range. And we'd get some bilingual listeners who would say, I'm comfortable talking about it in English. It never crossed my mind to even think about how to have a conversation like this in Arabic. So I think for us, that's also sort of been an exploration to navigate what it sounds like in Arabic, even if it's something we've talked about in a different language in English.
That's really fascinating, because one of the things that you've done at Kerning Cultures is to kind of connect from the communities that are based in the Middle East and also in the Middle East diaspora. Can you talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't work, even as you're navigating, and you've kind of switched into that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And I can also, for me as diaspora myself, like I think what's been really interesting is our team really ranges, right? So like for me, as marketing director, like I live in New York, but we have team members all over. And I think that's been, through any inception of a show, it's been so valuable for us to sort of open the floor for team members to give input from where they live about, like, well, for me living in diaspora, like some topics may be a little bit harder for me to grasp, or like the Arabic show may be harder for me to find and search, but if I'm not the audience, that's okay. So I think what we do a lot is when we are navigating new shows or season strategies, we really think about who our audience is. And so, for example, with Kerning Cultures, our English show, I think what we did with that show and making it English is that it was a space for diaspora listeners, but also accessible to listeners outside of the region who are just interested in learning more. So we find that a lot in editorial decisions we make, where we do, we don't explain everything, but we do kind of keep in mind that not every listener is going to know everything we're talking about. So sometimes we step back and have the hosts, play that role a bit and ask questions, or we'll, make sure. I think something that we gave me goosebumps the first time I heard an episode is like when you really pronounce names with, like, even in English, like our names are pronounced in proper like Arabic pronunciation. And I think we step back and make a clear decision about, like, with this show and with this host, who are we speaking to? Are we speaking to a pan-Arab audience? Are we speaking to, for example, maybe we're targeting a Saudi audience and the host is Saudi and the guest list will be Saudi. So we really try to think about who we're speaking to, and does that align well with the host's also like natural persona and topics and background as well, to make sure the two align. It's been really helpful, honestly, to sort of have our team members scattered, because sometimes something I may think about may not be something that the host may consider, or vice versa as well. So that's helped.
Oh, definitely. And thanks for, kind of locating where you are. In terms of connecting the dots again with diaspora or connected communities. I know, Laura, you've had a lot of conversations behind the scenes and of course on air, talking about your experiences navigating Spanish language audiences in North America and as well as across Latin America. So what works and what doesn't work?
I think it really works to portray stories that are true and honest to the representation of our listeners. Talking about like the contrast on working on a Spanish podcast while living in the US, I remember last semester I took fellowship on audio documentary, and I remember all my colleagues talking about how podcasts boomed in 2018 in the US, how nowadays the industry is changing so rapidly. And I was like, wait, but that's the industry in the US. We're talking about a moment, 2018 to say at least, where in places like Latin America, people were hearing the word podcast for the first time. So to us, it has been really different. And when I say us, I mean me as a podcast producer in Spanish, but also everyone that has tried to build a show to our audience, because we faced scenario when we had to build content first and then wait for the platform or for the technology to come help us out. And maybe until like today, we're like really waiting for some help to monetize our shows, because we don't have like this structure of donations that the US have. We don't have like this very developed countries that have like that are used to pay for content, for example, especially digital content. So to us, it has been a constant struggle on doing shows that represent us, but also that are true to our audiences. And I would love to hear like everyone else's thoughts on, for example, the phenomenon on influencers doing podcasts, because we see shows that might relate with the audience, but we also see shows that die at the first season because they didn't click. So to me, this is a really, really fascinating topic. And it's also a quest that we are measuring year by year to know like where are we heading and why are we taking the decisions on our content.
Absolutely. I see Rutendo, you're nodding. What's jumping out for you based on your experiences as a podcaster, but also having talked to so many podcast producers across Africa for the Podcast Sessions magazine and in your other work?
I'm just like, yeah, sorry, I forget that we can see each other on video. But Lara, what you've mentioned is very fascinating. So first I'll touch on what you said about the kind of like audio content creation side of things. What I find so fascinating is audio is something that's been around for such a long time in different forms. Podcasting is just a name that was put onto something that was already existing. And now we're sitting and we're like, how do we formulate this? It's really not that complicated if we think about it, which for me is really fascinating. Even from an African perspective, storytelling in Africa has always been there. It was told in many different forms. So that thing of listening to orated history, stories it's in our genetics, it's in our DNA across the world. And now what podcasting has done is just made it more accessible. So it's no longer closed off to the gatekeepers who say, you have the greatest voice or you have production talent. Anyone in their homes right now can pick something up and record and put it out there. And I think that's where the complexity lies. It's almost like now everyone can do it. And now everyone's like, okay, so what are we doing? How do we, almost box this thing so it can make sense? And I think that's where the issue lies. I think the more free we are, and if I look at where the US is with podcasting versus where even Africa is with podcasting, what excites me about Africa is we've seen what has been done in the US. And yes, there are certain things that we, draw and glean wisdom from and draw inspiration from. But we're almost like kids in a playground where we're like, we can do anything. We can do it in our mother tongue. We can do it sitting on a couch on the poolside. Let's go outside. Like there is no formula. And I think that's the beauty of this medium is it is right now not super corporate. It's not super, this is a podcast, this isn't a podcast. And then my thing on the influencers, I think is so fascinating because it's been coming up time and time again. We've seen some really big names. I'm not going to mention anyone because some of them I really admire, getting massive podcasting deals, like historical number figures where you're just like, they haven't even released an episode. They have not even looked at a microphone and they're getting millions too, because by their name, which is fantastic. But what people mustn't forget is that podcasting is a discipline. So I love seeing when people bring in radio talent or authors or people who have something to say. It's storytelling in a different format. It's media in a different format. If you have that discipline and you understand and respect the medium itself and the industry itself, I think you're more likely to continue. And I'm not saying influencers and celebrities don't. I'm just saying for me, sometimes I think their thought is, how can this impact or build my celebrity or build my influencing? It's not about the medium, it's about them. And with podcasting, I think it's about the medium. What is your message? Who is your audience? Who are you trying to connect with? What are you trying to engage with? What are you trying to solve for? Whether it's pottery or news, it doesn't really matter. But if you're not passionate about the content that you are speaking about, and you're just doing it because it's giving you this platform to raise who you are and maybe get a few sponsorship deals, it's going to fall by the wayside because your why probably wasn't even strong enough to enter, the industry in the first place. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Rutendo. I love Kim. Kim is applauding. I don't know if you can hear from where you are, but Kim. So I think one of the areas that I think of when I think about some of the work that you've been involved in is not just looking at podcasting from the Egypt and Middle East perspective, but also from your academic work, looking at communities that don't have standard English. And what I mean by this is communities that have their own English, their own, their own language, their own coda that's really allowed them to express themselves through podcasting. Mm-hmm. So what works and what doesn't work? Because I think you're working in between very, very different worlds and also seeing academics kind of making sense of podcasting in a different sense altogether?
Yeah, I think it speaks to a previous point in that like everyone can have this platform and use it to their advantage, but you need to go in it with a concerted effort, right?
Right.
It's nice to provide that, voice for the voiceless. That's the basis for journalism. It's the basis for community radio. And podcasting allows that with an even lower barrier to entry, which is what we love about it. And when I'm dealing with my colleagues, I just got off the phone, a Zoom call with one of my colleagues. He's like, hey, I want to do this big podcast. And it was very, very detailed. And just you don't have the skill set to do this, right? So I love the ambition, but how do we get him to having that end result that he desires? Where are you going to get those skills to do it? And I'm like, well, you have to outsource it. So enabling people to get their message out there and not compare yourself. That was mentioned previously as well. You can do it with whatever you have. And if that's your phone, no one has to know it's your phone. Why do we have to say I've got this $300 microphone? It's not the tool. It's what are you doing with those tools? And if people don't know that you've got this low budget podcast equipment, then it's not a big deal. In the same token, being able to say, hey, here are some resources. I tell people all the time, can my students produce your podcast? And not for free, but how do we enable them? And how do we create that collaboration to say that you don't have this, you have a great idea, you don't have the skills, let's put the people together. Do we have a studio that we can rent out, or do we have facilities that we can convert? So it's, trying to get other people into the space by any means necessary. And that involves doing workshops in communities that don't necessarily have access and allowing them the opportunity to think big, to say, hey, you can be doing a podcast on the same level with these influencers. This is the place where disruption is key. That is what we do in podcasting. We do not, I see a lot of people trying to play by the rules. I see a lot of radio stations getting into podcasting and doing podcasts like they do radio. But I have more admiration for the people who just come out and say, look, I don't have a format. This is what I do. I go rogue and I just have fun with it. And I think at the end of the day, that's the key, is trying to have fun. And remember this, all of these topics that are out there, someone's listening to these podcasts. And that's because they're filling a niche for that particular audience. And so that's what we can do to enable communities who don't feel like they have a voice, is to get them out there and let them know that they do. And there are listeners who want to hear it.
I love that you've taken us into the innovations within the context that we are all working in. You spoke about radio and how, people are walking into radio stations and finding that there is a way to radio, but not necessarily a way to podcast. And, one of the podcasts that I've kind of had a chance to interact with, Dandora Hip Hop City. So they have a radio show that's recorded in a radio station that is a podcast, but it's not necessarily broadcast on podcast platforms because most of their community who they want to target is on a social media platform. So they broadcast on that social media platform. So some of the ways that innovation is kind of shaping the podcast in your regions are really changing the way podcasting is done. So no format or my format, and what else is jumping out for you? And, I'll ask Bella to jump in here.
Yeah, I think with Arabic podcasts, something that we've been tackling since the beginning is just something as simple as the UX with left to right text on apps versus right to left text when you're typing in Arabic. And so for us, from day one, it was with Arabic shows, us and a lot of other podcasts in Arabic will list the show title in English as well for searchability, as well as just helping with the UX, helping people access it and find it on apps that aren't geared towards Arabic speaking or writing audiences. And so for us, I think it's been really lovely the past few years to see that more native apps, streaming apps in the region are incorporating podcasts like Anglophone. We're seeing Spotify, they got Arabic podcasts and podcasts onto their platform in the region, I think this past year. And so seeing that platforms that have been streaming music are now really paying attention to podcasts and realizing that's where a lot of really engaged listeners are has been really, really encouraging. And, you know, sometimes we'll even proactively reach out to these platforms, be like, great, happy to see it on there, but like, let's talk about your UX. Let's talk about how your UX can help podcast listeners. And I think seeing some partners like Enremi really do their homework in terms of like having, you know, like you can almost see the strategy as a music platform, having a podcast with a pop star like Elisa, right? Like you see them kind of holding the hands of music listeners over to podcasts. So I think seeing that happening and seeing that people who are in the audio space are really starting to turn to podcasts has been really great. You're also starting to see a lot more, I think for us, where we've been interested in just not every show has to be pan-Arab or be serious. We can kind of start experimenting, like as Kim was saying too, is like we can start experimenting with content and kind of having fun. Like what makes us excited? What are we listening to in English? Why do we feel like we can or can't be doing that in our own language, right? With our own content. So I think that's been really lovely to see. And I think something that it's so crazy to think it's not about innovation, but I think just as Laura was saying, like the educational piece with podcasts, the gap has been getting smaller, which has been nice. Like we look to the US market sometimes to see what trend predictions are like what is coming down the pipeline. But I think it's been really nice to see that, you know, a few years ago, conversations we were having with potential clients would always start with, do you listen to podcasts? Do you know what a podcast is? And do you know that brands can really be lucrative, like use podcasting to increase brand awareness? Now, what we're seeing is that like we go to brand, like we'll go talk to potential clients and they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm a podcast listener. What does it look like if a brand is on a podcast? So like the learning curve has gotten much smaller, which I think it's like, while it doesn't really scream innovation, it's really lovely to know that, you know, it's much less of a case to have to be making upfront. And we're seeing people, you know, reaching out to podcasters rather than having to be chased to take hold of those opportunities.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I love to hear that, because often innovation, it's a word that in the entrepreneurial world, like it always pop up, like we have to be innovative, but to us it's also like in our culture, just making it work. So I think one of the things that has been very, very interesting for me in the previous year on podcast in Spanish is how the producers themselves are starting to build like little networks of independent podcasts and find new ways of monetizing. Might be using platforms like Patreon, or might be using clients and then supporting their work with clients too. And also might be just working with an international team, which is I think it also has like a lot of challenges on remote production, on tape syncs, on also like methods, integrating stuff in your pipeline. So I think in a way, what we have learned from the US way of do stuff is to always like improve processes. And I think that's really useful, like using a timeline correctly and then come back and like track whatever happened, and then like using KPIs like very effectively. That's another way I think we can like measure our success and also build innovation for those coming by. Also, I think the biggest innovation for me is the audio fiction in Spanish. Like, how do we separate from the tradition Rutendo was mentioning of radionovelas for us, which was like little stories, but they were in radio and people loved them. And now I see people like doing radionovelas in podcasts, which I think is like, no, it's audio fiction and it's okay. But a lot of people are just like playing towards that format, like trying to do different stuff and also trying to have fun with the audio. And I think that's very, very interesting. To me, like in a personal level, being a mentor of other girls and people doing podcasts in Spanish, I think innovation also must go from transgender voices in front of the microphone. I think that's another level that we have to reach, not only preferring a white male host for the shows, but also exploring what transgender and queer voices in general can bring up to the table. Like it's a political thing. It's a place of enunciation. So I think a lot of innovation can come from extending those notions in audio. and also from working in little local global communities, I think.
Right. And especially, as you said, the little cafe is such a powerful place, in my experience, as well as all of yours. What have you found, Rutendo, to be innovation / how we do podcasts with fun, / how we do things normally, but that seems to be completely different from what's happening in perhaps another region?
Yeah, I think that, just in terms of how people do podcasting differently is, I think one of the things people are looking into is, why are you starting this podcast? So if you are starting it as a fun project, you're not doing it for money, you're not doing it for anything else, I do see a lot more liberation and the risks that people are willing to take, because at the end of the day, this is fun, So I am willing to, maybe I do my intro differently, maybe I'll do this with the next podcast, maybe we'll add a segment and we'll keep adding segments. So you're seeing a lot more people have fun when the pressure is a little bit off. When you're getting into more corporate or people who want to monetize podcasts, more of that area, there is a lot more strictness or structure, and you can hear it. It is a little bit more scripted, and sometimes you can hear the hosts reading the content. So I think what's important is to remember that you need to be able to connect with the content you're creating. Again, we are listeners and we're very smart, actually. We can hear when you are reading something. We can hear when you have no idea what the discussion is about and you are literally reading question for question for question, and you're not reading I think this is also something else, is like, we need to train hosts, because don't just go question answer. I've asked you a question. You've just said, look, I just bumped into Oprah. She gave me $1 billion. And I'm like, great answer. So tell me, what a moment, guys. Let's pause on that. Do you know what I mean? So it's, we mustn't forget that there is a discipline to this, and that great hosts, great conversationalists, great producers have been, excuse me, my eye's stuck. Ow. Have been in this game for a really, so it's a female, podcast panel and tour. People have been in this industry for a while, and I'm not saying you can't step into this industry and enjoy yourself and have fun and experiment. Do that, but remember that there's also an art form to it. Learn, read, see what's happening. Laura was talking about, looking at research, what's happening, what are you taking from the US? You have to be able to think about your podcast outside your podcast if you want to grow and expand, and all of the pretty horses and the pretty things. It's just great to know. What Gabriella was talking about is very fascinating, because I'll touch on Africa Podfest and Baraza Media Lab's amazing research, the Discovery to Data edition. Historical information that came out on the continent. But, as we were having the discussion around it, you were saying there was a lot of change that's happening in these platforms. And how it's so important for these platforms to think about the user experience, to think about the person accessing it, to think about the podcaster. What are the benefits of coming to your platform? Because if we are seeing a lot of changes in terms of who's at the top and who's leading, we have to understand that we're all very independent, and there's this is the most popular thing to do, and that's why we're doing it. And I think that's interesting. And the last thing I will say, just in terms of I think having a voice and what we need to see more of. Yes, to Laura's point around that diversity of voices, but I think and yes, I am singling out men often forget is, you are sometimes in your conversations enabling either behaviors or justifying certain things. I don't think people actually understand the power of the podcasts and the power of their listeners, because then I don't think you would so freely say certain things or do certain things, because you say it, you leave, you go home, but you're forgetting that, yes, this is you might not think you're doing it, but you are making a stance. This is a political thing. This is a cultural thing. This is so much bigger than, I have an opinion and I think, as a guy. And so many, I know people make fun of it, especially on TikTok, when men are not trying to mansplain things. All I'm saying to male creators is just, you have privilege in being a man. Sometimes just take a step back and say, you know what, in my community, in my listeners, let me actually be sensitive about this. I have an opinion, but I also have a voice. And I also am influencing people by having this, you know, platform and this voice. So I hope in a very roundabout way that I'm sort of kind of answering your question.
Absolutely. I saw Kim snap her fingers. This is it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally want to piggyback on some of what she said. I mean, and that is the point of making space. And, you know, I really want to see more men acquiesce, you know, that leadership and that power that they have in the field. I mean, luckily for us with the Ehky Ya Masr podcast, for years, we were female led. We only have one guy on our team. So just like, you know, we are pretty much running our own show and setting our own tone. The thing that I would like to see be a little bit different, or at least what I'm doing in this space, is I teach. So this is my opportunity to prepare students to work in this field. And I have a long running list of those who have gone from the classroom to working in audio, which is great. And I'm hoping that means that they have the foundation to do the thing and get paid for it as a career. So what I'm trying to do now is thinking about audio technology, like a Descript. Like, you know, is that something I should be teaching in class? And the answer, I believe, is yes, because that does have an impact on the future and preparation for our future audio practitioners. And so I also want the students and listeners to know about the slow cook that is really good quality audio production. And the slow cook means like we aren't churning out episodes every week. You know, with the really good storytelling, usually, I'm sure with the Kerning Cultures, you're working on stories now that people may not hear for another 3-4 months, if not longer. And we've heard this with, there was a recent podcast I was listening to, I can't remember, it's escaping me at the moment, the one with Al Letson that's up for Peabody. And he said he was working on that for like 4 or 5 years. So listeners don't realize that slow cook. And so we really have to sort of train them that, yeah, we can do a talk podcast and those can come out every week. But those real rich investigative narrative nonfiction pieces take more time. And so I really am interested in trying to educate audiences in that regard. And the last thing that I want to mention is something that Gabrielle was mentioning, that inclusivity, the diverse inclusivity. That, you know, in the US, when they think of diversity, they're like, how many Black people do we have that work for this company? Like, well, in my perspective from audio, I want diversity to be how many, Laura mentioned, you know, transgender and queer. We're talking about the international component. When I'm involved with organizations, I'm like, yeah, I don't want it to just be US centric. I don't want it to be male centric. Like, how do we diversify intentionally so that the industry just has more to offer? I want to hear a story of, say, what, an Apple, but from so many different perspectives, right? Like, that's what entices me and enriches me and makes me interested in listening to different podcasts. It is that kind of diversity. So trying to bring more of that to the table. I think it takes work. If we're going to sit and hope for it to happen, it's not. You know, we have to call people out. I recently called out a Mano at a conference that I went to, and I called them out by tagging them on Twitter. And then they came up to me at the conference like, why did you call us out? Like, you can expect me to call you out. We are not going to hide behind this problem. We're going to call people out, and we're gonna make change happen. Like, if you don't think that you can, we're a panel of what, 5 women right now talking about podcasting. They're like, we can't find a woman to talk on this topic. I'm like, that's absurd. You didn't even try. We have tons of women and trans. We have tons of people. Like, who do you want a podcast speaker to be about? From what region? Like, we can, all of us can give someone a panelist in what, 5 minutes? It's just like, we can do it. So I could go on this topic forever, but yes, this is the challenge that we have, right?
It definitely is. And also I've kind of witnessed what's working across the different podcasts that I've been involved in, is that we're getting a lot of people saying, how do you make your podcast accessible, not just by language, but also by making them accessible to people with disabilities and people who are in communities where the only way to get podcasts is perhaps sending it as a attachment on a social media platform. And that's literally the only way people will get access to it. And Kim, you've taken us into our last question of this panel. I know we've taken, like, we've kind of hinted at where we could take this conversation, but there's such powerful visioning in all your words and what you're saying. I'd love you to each say, you know, kind of what's your vision for audiences and people who are looking to develop international audiences who are listening and trying to kind of wrap their heads around what we've tried to capture in this short time that we have. So what's your vision going forward now that we've kind of scratched the surface of what lies beyond Anglophone podcasting? I will start with Gabriela.
Yeah, sorry, I know my subtitle is confusing between Gabriela and Bella. Yeah, I think for anybody listening, I think really betting on this audience, whether it's like, you know, each of us are speaking to different listeners, but I think understanding that it's not a niche anymore. At this point, we're all like, when we look at our region in the Middle East and North Africa, like we always use this as an example that our region, while we started using smartphones and social media apps after, you know, the US, we've bypassed their usage. Like the Middle East is at the top, right? So we feel like the same can be said about podcasts. Like while we're a few years behind, you can bet on the fact that we're about to be the top users, the top listeners. The reason we chose podcasting over another medium was because it is more accessible with people's like data limitations or internet access. Like accessing audio over video content already is less data on your phone. And so I think seeing that behavior from the get-go about where to provide the content is something we're betting on. And just trusting that, yeah, like we're seeing a lot more brands coming to the region from outside. So like European brands or US brands coming in and trying to reach our audience in our language. And so just trusting the native content creators on the ground to do their job the way they know how and to reach their audience for you. So I think, you know, the best partners we've had have been partners who trust us to do that, who trust us with the content and trust us in Arabic, even though they may be a team from Europe or whatever, you know. That's been, I think, the best recipe for success, where they come in and they say, like, you tell us what the best way to like really emotionally connect with your listeners will be.
Thank you. Laura?
I want to reply like about everything Gabriela said, because this is so enlightening, actually. I think my biggest learning on the future of audiences actually came from Josephine and from the African Podcast Fest. That I remember one time we called about building community, and you said a community is not what you invest in, it's also like the time you spend on something, make it work, you know. It's the time you spend with other people. It's not only like subscribing to something. So I think we have been ignoring that. Like, and I say this as a goal, and also like I think a lot of the future of our shows depend on this. Following to what Gabriela just said, there are a lot of brands and corporations and networks approaching us, trying to reach our audience and try to catch our audience. But we have to be the first to engage with them and to show them like what's the real power of a community. Like African Podcast Fest is a huge example for me about that. And it takes to think as a team and also invest as a team, but you have to be the first trying to monetize or trying to build that audience, because if you don't do it, a brand is going to come and they all want is their money behind it. So I think that is like the biggest challenge, and also like the huge thing to understand, like understanding we're not a niche anymore, and understanding too, we are allowed to ask more about our sponsors and our allies on building communities in podcasting. And for those who are watching this panel and maybe have a favorite show, you know, tweet about it, share about it, send it to your family. It sounds like something very little, but it's not like you just listen to one podcast. And to a producer, it means the world for you approaching them and tweeting about the show, sharing it and saying like, I can see how they took the slow cook on this one. So yeah, that's like the biggest goal.
Thank you so much, both of you. Going to Rutendo, what's your vision for audiences going forward and audience building across the international world outside of what we know?
Well, I think when it comes to audience building, I think one, and I've said it, passion first, passion above everything else. People can hear it in your voice. People know when you like something or when they're just like, you sort of kind of are going to watch or listen to this podcast because it's, you don't want to miss out. Passion is key. I would definitely say whatever you have, whatever vision you have to create something, do it. If it's a painting podcast, do it. Historical, do it. Scripted or unscripted, political or, about a marginalized community or group, do it, because you will find your community in that. And it's so interesting. If you actually go onto any platform right now and look up your interest, I'm telling you right now, you will find a podcast about that, which just goes to show people are looking for that content. I would also say that the market isn't saturated. Whatever you heard about, there are too many business podcasts, there are too many health podcasts, there are too many spiritual and religious podcasts. They're not enough. Whatever you're seeing and you think it's enough, that's tiny. There is room for your business podcast and your independent podcast. And if you want 5 different podcasts, do it. You don't have to try and fit everything into one podcast, which also comes down to, I think, when people are thinking of who are you podcasting for, don't say you're podcasting for everyone. You're trying to reach everyone. Don't say that and don't approach it in that way. Approach your community as you're talking to a friend who knows you or someone who knows this content. It doesn't have to be for everyone. And then, excuse me, the last thing I will say is just think outside the box. So it's not just about a podcast, right? So what can you do outside that sphere to create something else? Whether it is like an Africa Podfest and you're building, a community, whether it's podcast sessions and you're building a podcast, whether it's, Kerning Cultures and you're building podcasts. Think about podcasting outside the box of I'm just doing a podcast, but look at the gaps in the market and try and fill those gaps because you're, again, creating community and opportunity and growing the space as well.
Thank you so much. Kim, just to close us out in terms of like your last take on visioning.
I want to see more data out there. And when I say more data, I'm talking about more diverse data from other parts of the world. It's really exciting for me when I see research and audience research on from different countries and not just the big places like the UK and the US and Australia. So I love that, Africa Podfest has that collaboration where, now there's some data and that data is going to grow year after year. And we had the Latin listening report. Edison did one for Black listeners as well. More of that, please, and thank you. If it's not out there, it means maybe someone else should be doing it, meaning that's a void that can be filled. So I definitely want to see more data and that kind of audience research.
All right, thank you. And I think just to close us out completely, if you could all say one thing that you're working on that people should check out. It could be a podcast episode, it could be a project that you're launching, just so that people can find you. I know we'll drop all your social handles for this panel separately, but just one project, one item, something that people can take away that they should check out right now. We'll start with Laura.
Please check on podcasteros.com. We are doing a survey on Spanish-speaking audiences. We have a newsletter. We have a directory of talent. So please go check out podcasteros.com and reach me out at laurawate.com.
Yes, Bella?
Yeah, I think fitting to this panel, we, for almost over 5, maybe 7 years now, have been producing Kerning Cultures English podcast, and sort of as a natural journey of our network, we finally released the Arabic soul sister, almost like the Arabic version of that podcast called Mesafet. And Mesafet means distances in Arabic, so kind of alluding to the spaces kerning between letters. So definitely check that out. It actually just released this past week.
Kim?
Yes, I'm working on several research projects at the moment. My big project that will probably take at least another 2 years is extensive research on the history of Black podcasters. That's coming in several iterations. And I'm also doing some other research articles that will be out before the year is up.
Thank you. And Rutendo?
You said one thing, I know. So the podcast sessions, definitely check out the podcast sessions. I think it is a platform for your voice to be heard. So we want to hear people share their stories, talk to us about like your tech processes, your production processes, anything to do with podcasting. We really want to start sharing that information, which would be amazing for the magazine. And then for the actual website, news, whatever you're doing, a press release, a launch, discovery, whatever news you have that you want to share with the Pan-African podcast world, podcast sessions, email us, and we will help you share your story with the rest of the continent.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone who's watching this Beyond Anglophone Podcasting. We couldn't possibly get deeper than, we just like literally like, here's a little bit of a taste. We have had such an amazing panel. Thank you so much, Bella, Ibrahim, Kim Fox, Laura Ubaté, Rutendo, Nyamuda. Thank you all for agreeing to say so much and in just like a little bit of time. We wish we had much more time. Please engage with everybody who you've seen on this panel. My name is Josephine Karianjahi. I've been your moderator for today, and I bet you will surprise yourself. So thank you so much for joining us for this panel. So thank you, everyone.